Okay, friends, I'm coming back to you on Sunday, July 9, and there's a little more fleshing out I need to do on the good and evil topic. So let's just let's start out by summarizing one point we made, which is that God cannot be or cannot have exhaustive foreknowledge without also predetermining everything that will take place. Because exhaustive foreknowledge entails establishing all of the conditions at the very beginning which determine all subsequent events and actions and so on. And specifically within the context of revealed religion, since creation is neither an expansion nor an extension of God's being, but rather something outside of himself, although it may come from God or from within God, however you choose to put that, it's not ultimately identical with him in any way. So there's that fundamental separateness, which is the reason for the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. As a result, even though God is acknowledged to be eternal, the doctrine is constructed in such a way that one is forced to recognize that God's conceiving of and also designing the world happens prior to, quote unquote, the actual creation of it, or the actual bringing into existence of it. So he is, when we speak of foreknowledge then in that context, God is not just creating the beginning and then looking forward. He is seeing the end from the beginning, and he's seeing the beginning from the end. Which means that there is really no such thing as free will within the context of revealed religion, or within the context of this fundamental duality of Abrahamic religion. So you're left with, or the Christian is, or the Abrahamic is left with two extreme options. If God predetermined everything, then when he conceived of sin, he also created sin. Conceiving of something, creating it, and predetermining it are the same thing. It's just three different ways of talking about the same thing. So he would be the author of sin, the creator of sin, the creator of evil. Or you could go the other route, which is to blame the introduction of sin or evil on a creature, a finite creature. But, either Lucifer or Eve or both. But in doing that, if you're blaming it ultimately on a creature, then what you are inadvertently doing is limiting God to the status of creaturehood. Because if the creature is literally bringing evil into being and not God, then God is no longer predetermining. And if God is no longer predetermining, he doesn't even have foreknowledge, because the two entail each other. And if he doesn't have foreknowledge, then he's just a creature like any other creature. So you have those are your two options if you're an Abrahamic. Either God created evil, or he is a creature. He's not God at all. The reason the first, the former statement that God created evil cannot be said about the God of Dharma is we have to make this distinction. In the Abrahamic religions, God is unlimited and infinite and in his being when he predetermines the existence of evil. He is not, as in Dharma, entering into a lower key, so to speak, by fragmenting himself or distributing himself throughout the manifested realm, which is the realm of duality, Maya, illusion, and ignorance. So when God, in his various iterations, engages in negative or bad or quote-unquote sinful behavior, he is acting not in his capacity as the totality of his being, but in the capacity of one who, in that particular iteration, has been limited by the volition of God in his essence, or by God in the totality of his being. God in his totality has voluntarily allowed himself to also experience limitation. Whereby he then, in his various iterations, must return to himself by rediscovering who he is and transcending the ego, which is under the false perception that duality is all that there is and that beings are all separate. And of course, again, I have to reiterate that when I say transcend it, you're not necessarily transcending the realm of manifestation. There's nothing evil intrinsically about the realm of manifestation. You're simply coming to a realization, not just intellectually, but experientially. The realization, a new perception of what reality actually is, which can be had in this life before one puts off the body. Now, if one of my old Calvinistic buddies came back to me and said, well, Jonathan, why don't you just, congratulations, you've seen the light, why don't you come back to Calvinism? Well, I mean, one of the major reasons I transitioned out of Calvinism into Orthodoxy in the first place is due to an insurmountable problem that Calvinism has. There are many such problems, but this is just one, which I've never seen a Calvinist address. I will go ahead and just out of charity acknowledge that it's certainly possible that it's been addressed and I simply haven't seen it or noticed it. But I don't see how it could be overcome. And that is, if humanity, according to Calvinism, which believes in double predestination, that God predestined some for eternal hell and others for eternal life, If indeed, as they teach, the human nature is intrinsically depraved, not just intrinsically, but thoroughly, utterly, and totally depraved, then good luck finding a way to exempt the Son of God, the second member of the Trinity, from entangling himself in the taint of human depravity in the incarnation. So the only viable solution at this point is Dharma. That's the third and only option that makes sense. And by the way, you can't have a fall of any kind. You're not just not able to have a Christian fall in the sense that we see in Genesis 3, with Eve disobeying a specific command and then partaking of the tree she was told not to eat from. You can't have any kind of narrative built on a fall, such as what we find in certain variations of Platonism, or let's say Origenism, where the soul falls from this initially pristine state, or at least innocent state, and then falls through the various dimensions, shall we say, and then cools as it descends and becomes more opaque and solid, taking on solidity and taking on more, a more coarse form. Because as I've said in a previous video on this idea of there having been a fall subsequent to the creation of manifested reality. If, in other words, let me back up. So what I'm saying is sin, so to speak, or evil, must be the product of manifestation itself. If we posit that evil is something that was introduced subsequent to the coming into being of manifested reality, or the coming into being of time as we perceive and experience it, then you have the dilemma of explaining how the fall could have occurred from a formerly pristine state. So if the soul was in a formerly pristine or innocent state, right? Let's say if the soul was in perfect communion with God, then you have to ask how it could have fallen to begin with. And if it was able to fall to begin with, if it was perfect, it couldn't fall, right? But if it did fall, then there was something inherently imperfect about the creation of the soul. There was something in the soul's ontology that compelled it to sin, or determined that it would stray from God and stray from communion with the divine. So now you're having to impute impurity to God himself. that's why you cannot posit that sin was introduced later. That's why it doesn't make sense to suggest that Lucifer introduced sin in the heavenly realm and that Adam and Eve introduced it in the earthly realm. Which, by the way, and I'm not going to digress on this too much, or excuse me, I'm not going to stray too much from the topic of this video, but I do just want to point out in passing that that in and of itself is an extremely odd scenario, that Christianity would posit not only this radical dualism between God and creation, between the creator and the creation, but in the created realm itself, you have a radical duality between the angels and the human race. So Lucifer's sin, in other words, doesn't directly affect human mortality or immortality, and it doesn't affect whether Adam and Eve have or come to acquire a knowledge of good and evil or not, only indirectly, to the extent that Lucifer is permitted to enter into the human realm and attempt to cause Adam and Eve to oppose themselves to the will of God, in the command not to eat of the forbidden fruit, right? That is extremely ironic that you have two sets of dualities. You have this duality within creation, where the redemption of man doesn't in any way lead to the redemption of the angelic world, and the fall of the angelic world does not have a direct or immediate impact on the human world. So anyway, just an interesting fact, and I'll move on from there now. But the story of the fall in Genesis was obviously very carefully and ingeniously conceived and narrated. It employs some very powerful archetypal symbolism and imagery, which over the millennia has seized the human psyche nearly irresistibly, which is why you've got over 2 billion Christians in the world. Christianity actually is the largest religion in terms of membership in the world. So these ideas have taken hold of the human psyche in a way that's very difficult to explain or fully understand. But clearly the archetypes that were employed to explain sin and to guilt-rid humanity was very masterfully and artfully employed. So now, another interesting side note, and I'm not gonna, again, I don't want to spend too much time on something that I can't totally prove, but I do suspect that the story may have, maybe not in its particulars, in its detail, but in a general sense have some relationship to an event within human history. In Dharma, there are 4 yugas, or ages, and according to most accounts, these ages follow what we call the long calendar, which suggests that the Satya Yuga is the first age. It's a golden age, and it's the longest age. I don't remember. I want to say 1.3 billion years or something like that. And then there's I don't have the names of them memorized. I used to. I think Tretya Yuga might be the next one, and then Dvapara Yuga, and then the Kali Yuga, which is what we're currently in, which is the dark age, the age of hedonism, materialism, gross ignorance, selfishness, hatreds, murders, jealousies, blah, blah, blah. A gross lack of spirituality. And that age supposedly started actually right around the time of the biblical event of the Noahic flood, according to all of the accounts I have seen. And it seems that these golden ages, again, according to everything I have read, are characterized by much longer lifespans, a much higher quality of life, and so forth. And it would seem that, if I'm recalling accurately, mankind's body was even of a higher quality in those ages. And as man, quote unquote, descended from one age to the next, he took on a grosser and grosser form, potentially. So, because we have a number of subtle bodies, and those subtle bodies exist within the physical body, and so we lost the ability to live within the subtle body, within these subtler bodies. And I think that transition, the story of Adam and Eve could be describing a transition from one age to another. So it wouldn't be the introduction of ignorance or Maya for the first time that we're seeing in Genesis, but rather just a descent from one degree of Maya to a higher degree of Maya. I think that that does it for this one. Pretty sure I covered everything I wanted to say in this, so I will start thinking about the next topic. And I want to remind you all too that I welcome questions and even requests for certain topics. So if there's anything you just have a burning desire to hear about, I would be very willing to tailor my video making around whatever it is that you guys are wanting to hear about. So thanks a lot, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday.